Joining our broadcast now is Vladimir Solovian, head of the Hybrid Threat Analysis Group at the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. Vladimir, good afternoon. We are pleased to welcome you live on the FREM television channel.
Good afternoon and hello. Vladimir, how do you really assess everything that has happened? I am referring to the latest incursion of Russian Terrorist Federation aircraft into the skies of NATO member states. Yeah, NATO countries had to respond. But is it a sufficient response? Of course, there's that point here. From our perspective, we can't criticize the North Atlantic Alliance. And yet, I think we can still assess it. I think the statements by NATO leadership certainly don't provide enough specifics about what level of threat NATO perceives as the red line beyond which a direct response, using conventional weapons, would follow. And we will finally see a downing, or at least a more active attempt to deter Russia than what we've been witnessing for several years now, with NATO aircraft intercepting Russian aircraft violating European airspace. However, at the same time, we must consider the important aspect of NATO's ambiguity regarding Russia's actions. This helps Western countries maintain room to maneuver, but it also creates a sense of unease in Moscow, as it doesn't know, and the Kremlin leadership can't determine, what provocative action against European countries will trigger a harsh response, which will impact Russia's military capabilities to maintain its presence in various regions of Europe. Russia is currently focused specifically on the war against Ukraine, and creating threats to Scandinavia and the Baltic states requires Moscow to overextend its currently depleted resources. Therefore, Moscow's key tactic remains the creation of minor provocations, such as airspace violations. Well, if NATO responds harshly, either by downing aircraft or attempting to land and seize Russian pilots, this will require the Russian leadership to take more aggressive measures to deploy military forces in the region, specifically against the Baltic states or Poland. But Moscow currently lacks such resources. All it can do is reinforce its regular forces or transfer its Far Eastern units, which are already very outnumbered. Given that all its resources are focused on Ukraine, as we understand, this scenario is certainly unfavorable for Moscow, and it will try to maintain the informational component of the standoff to the last, rather than escalate to a direct confrontation that would subsequently require the deployment of troops on the NATO border, since, for now at least, the fighting in Ukraine is still in the active phase. Moscow doesn't have the strength to begin a similar deployment and concentration of forces in the immediate future, I mean in the coming months, against NATO countries in the Baltics or Northern Europe, and particularly in Scandinavia. Look, if, let's say, Moscow lacks the strength for such full-scale aggression, even to open what's called a second front, then, by and large, it's entirely possible to make life difficult for EU and NATO countries. For example, yes, those planes flew into NATO airspace. And those recent hot air balloons, they were supposedly carrying contraband, but there were a huge number of them, and they were located within, so to speak, the airport's operational zone. And, in fact, they might not have posed a military threat, but even if a passenger aircraft had collided with them, people would certainly have been hurt. Is that not a serious threat? And, in my opinion, NATO countries need to accept this reality. They need to fight a terrorist federation that has made their lives impossible now, not later. Incidentally, here's the thing. NATO fully supports the US President's initiative to end the Russian Federation's war against Ukraine. Secretary General Ryu, mentioned above, stated this after his meeting with Trump. He confirmed that Washington is ready to join the security guarantee system for Ukraine. Ryuta also noted the catastrophic losses of Russian troops, calling the situation untenable. Let's listen and discuss the nuances. It was Russia that started this war, and it's moving in the wrong direction. Looking specifically at this year, the territory they've seized in Ukraine is extremely limited. And against the backdrop of the enormous number of dead and seriously wounded, the Russian economy is in dire straits. We know that there are now long lines at gas stations across Russia. We know that the President of France and other European countries have stepped up their efforts to crack down on the shadow fleet. And, of course, we've seen the American president pressuring some European countries to stop buying Russian oil. So, all of this is having an impact. Therefore, I'm absolutely convinced that with continued pressure, we can bring Putin to the negotiating table.
All of this really is having an impact, don't you think? What will be more effective? Sanctions pressure. We're seeing it from both the United States and the European Union. I'm referring to the 19th package, which has already been adopted, and work on the 20th package, together with Ukraine, is about to begin. Or should this involve armed pressure? I'm referring to the active supply of the most modern weapons to Ukraine, including long-range ones. Not necessarily tomahawks. Is there a choice in this lineup, or should it all be combined? And only then, as Ryuta noted, will it really be possible to bring Putin to the negotiating table? What do you think about this?
Of course, these factors, sanctions and arms aid to Ukraine, must work synergistically. This is a complex issue, because without the supply of modern weapons capable of deterring Russian attacks in the Ukrainian rear and on the front lines, Ukraine will face a shortage of manpower, given Russia's dominance in the theater of operations. Considering that Russia is conscripting approximately 30,000 to 40,000 troops into its armed forces every month and deploying them to continue its attempts to occupy Ukrainian regions, this process could intensify in the coming months and have more serious consequences for Ukraine, particularly given the increasing pace of territorial loss. And I believe NATO doesn't fully appreciate the complexity of the situation for Ukraine, given the approaching winter, which could significantly impact the ability of the Ukrainian rear to meet the needs of the Ukrainian armed forces and the shortage of armed personnel on the front lines. If European and NATO officials continue to measure the situation in percentages of territory, this will only lead to reassurance, not to real action that could help Ukraine confront Russia today and now. If NATO is unwilling to directly fight Moscow tomorrow, then all resources today should be directed toward funding Ukraine's military-industrial complex so that Ukraine can scale up production of drones that directly damage Russian refineries and other energy facilities. Only in this way can they effectively influence production volumes in Russia and create a fuel crisis, including an energy crisis, which could impact public support for the actions of the Russian leadership. but not in the sense that people in Russia will protest or otherwise attempt to overthrow the current regime. First and foremost, they should consider whether they should continue to fight in Ukraine and how they can improve their own situation. You
must agree that they should have considered this much earlier. Vladimir Solovian, head of the Hybrid Threat Analysis Group at the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, was a guest on a live broadcast on the Freedom TV channel. He